Hi, my name's Monique Elliott, or as the students refer to me as Miss Elliott. I had my third round of pre-service teaching at Padua College in Mornington. I was lucky enough to engage in taking lessons in both my methods of physical education and health from Year 7s through to Year 11. But today I'll be focusing my reflection on a Year 8 lesson focused on the skeletal system. This was the second lesson I was taking for this unit of work. The learning outcome that I chose to use from the Victorian curriculum was under the Year 7 and 8 Health and PE description of moving the body. The objective was to practice, apply, and transfer movement concepts and strategies. In this lesson, I aim to provide students with the knowledge of different bones and how these movements occur at the bones. Before I move on to my reflection, I thought I would recap my first lesson with these students and how my mental and my own reflection shaped this lesson that I took. So in the first lesson with these students, I simply stood at the front of the class as a lecturer and went over the body parts and terminology, and students were simply just taking down notes while I went through the slides. After this lesson, I reflected and I was pretty disappointed in how I ran this class, as it was definitely not aligned with my pedagogy. I think I was so set on trying to fit as much content into one lesson that I didn't cater for students' individual learning skills or abilities, and it definitely wasn't engaging. Churchill discusses a classroom behaviour theorist, Kuhn, in 1970, who describes the term witherness. This theory focuses on students' verbal and non-verbal cues for how a lesson is going and picking up on these cues for the rest of the lesson, or also using it for future lessons. So using Kuhner's 1970 theory of witherness, I took on board that some students felt like I was moving too fast and I could see that the class wasn't engaged. So I decided to turn a new page, as I wanted to help my students learn to the best of their ability whilst having fun. But I also wanted to cater for different ways of learning, so I also implemented in Howard Gardner's 1993-1999 theory of multiple intelligences, which is something I always come back to when planning a lesson. I like to try and implement as many as possible into my classes, as I understand that all my students have different ways of learning and different levels of ability. In this lesson I included a Kahoot quiz, which is not only a great use of ICT, but it also was a great assessment of learning to see what my students have retained from Lesson 1. Kahoot allows to use images within questions, which is great for both our logical and visual learners. Everyone was extremely engaged in this quiz, and I was so surprised to see what students have retained from Lesson 1, but it was also great to see the areas students were struggling with, and therefore what I should be focusing my next lesson on. I also brought in a human-sized skeleton for my kinesthetic and visual learners to use so that they could feel and see all the bones. Students were also given a paper so they could colour it in and label the different bones whilst going through the slides or coming up and playing with the skeleton. I still ran a lecture-style PowerPoint presentation, but this was broken up with these activities. Although the content was not as extensive as the first lesson, my students seemed to be a lot more engaged and also really learning from the different activities. So I think it was good to step back and realise that it is okay to take time with my students to ensure they are understanding the content and also actively involved within their learning. Although this lesson was running smoothly for most students, there were some who seemed a bit excited, especially after the Kahoot quiz, and I was constantly having to ask them to stop talking, which was taking time out of the lesson. So I decided to implement Skinner's 1938 theory of operant conditioning, which on page 84 of Churchill's Teachers Making a Difference defines this as the use of positive and negative consequences to strengthen or weaken voluntary behaviours. I really like this series. The few times I have used it, students really adapt their behaviour to what I expect out of them, and I like that it doesn't have to always be used in a negative way. I explained to my students that the amount of time it takes for me to stop them means the amount of time they would have to stay back. It got up to 3 minutes and I could see that the students were frustrated with this, but unfortunately it kept happening. So instead I decided to use Skinner's theory in a positive way, and I explained to the students that if they behaved well from now until the end of the lesson, I would gradually take off these minutes. This worked really well, and students calmed down, and for the rest of the lesson it ran really smoothly and students were let out on time, except for 3 boys who I asked to stay back. At the end of the lesson, as I was walking around the room, I was looking over the shoulder of some students who had been giggling, and I could see them communicating with one another over a shared Google document. I decided to let this go as it was the end of the lesson and I had to wrap up the class, and I really didn't want to take any more of the lesson telling students off. So, using Skinner's theory again, I disciplined these boys by explaining in our next PE class they'd be staying back to help pack up the equipment, which they actually did. I absolutely love this class, and although I had to implement behaviour strategies, I didn't have to yell or I didn't get angry with them, as the use of Skinner's theory worked really well. Although for future lessons with these students, I would really be interested to see how a seating plan would work to combat constant talking. So yeah, thank you for listening.